First things first, I'm coming out of a cold, so apologies for any croakiness of my voice or grogginess in my demeanor throughout the rest of this video. I got a book for St. Patrick's Day. I've ordered this and it's just arrived. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, translated by Simon Armitage. I don't know very much about the Arthurian legends, like from popular media. I think I know all the main characters, your Guinevere's, your Lancelots, your Merlins, but and Gawain, yeah, I have like a kind of an idea, but mostly from like Monty Python and the Holy Grail and stuff, like I don't know the OG stories, so I'm very excited to get into this and sort of fill that little gap in my knowledge and my reading. And I'm also very excited because it is a poem. It's a book-length narrative poem, and that is exactly what I mentioned in my last video as something which I felt was missing in my life. And then I was thinking maybe it's missing from yours too. Narrative poetry is really like having your cake and eating it, right? Like, you want characters, themes, plot, you got it, right? But if you want the richness of language where every single word needs to like balance or counterbalance the work as a whole, then you need to have poetry. And you can have that too, like in the same book. So it's almost like cheating. It feels like cheating. So I decided to make a recommendations list for narrative poetry, separating it into beginner, intermediate, and difficult. My idea here was that like the beginner would be for someone who is not so into poetry, and maybe just dipping their toes in, right? And so those books are more narrative-y, like more like normal novels, and then just like upping the difficulty of the sort of poetic reading experience, I guess, as it goes. But you'll see what I mean. Let's start off the list with the book I reviewed in my last video, and that kind of like inspired me to make this list in the first place, The Emperor's Babe by Bernardine Evaristo. This is about a young, sassy teenage girl, Zuleika, growing up in London in the Roman Empire period. I mentioned in that video that I listened to this book on audiobook and I didn't even realize it was a poem. I just thought it was like quite rhythmic and like pretty language. So that shows that this is more like a novelty kind of poem, and you could just read it as a book. And honestly, like, I don't think the poetry is the main thing here in it, really. Like, I mean, the main character is a poet, so it's not totally superfluous either, right? But I think it's a good way in. This next one might be a little bit difficult to get your hands on, although there's loads of different like editions of different versions of these Japanese poetic diaries. This is like a book I really love. But the most famous of these is The Narrow Road to the Deep North by Matsuo Basho, and that's, like, I think very easily available. But these are, the reason that they're in the beginner section is because like the poetic diaries are mostly like narrative, like verse, just people doing their diary, and then they stick in haiku like every so often, and it's like that balance between prose and poetry. So like it's not full on poetry all the time. You've got all these little, if that's too much poetry for you, you've got like little narrative breaks for most of it, to be fair. I was just thinking about one of these like this morning, was it? The verse record of my peonies by what's he called? Shiki, Masaoka Shiki. And like it's this guy and he's sick, he's got tuberculosis, the illness which will eventually kill him. And it's a very short diary. It's like only like 6 pages or something like that. But it's it's like a record of these flowers, these peonies that people gave him, and he put them on his bedside table. And obviously they slowly die, right? Because they're cut flowers. And he's just like writing all these haiku about them, like going through these stages. And they're very funny and lively haiku, but also if you think about it, from the point of view of someone who's got a terminal illness, it's got resonances, let's say. Honestly, I just find any excuse I can to talk about Japanese poetic diaries because I love this form. Finally, for this beginner section, I want to mention like some long poems that are not really like book length in and of themselves, but are often published like a separate book, like this one, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This actually looks like a proper book, but it's got like essays in it. It's got 2 versions of the poem and stuff, so it's not actually that long if you're just going for the poem itself. This is Water, Water Everywhere, and Not a Drop to Drink. It's like kind of classic and gothic. Also like The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. That's just like such a fantastic poem. He invented his own little form just for that poem, which I love. I love when writers like invent a structure specifically for the piece of work that they're producing. It's just like a little thing that that always makes me excited about a work. But yeah, The Raven does that, and it's like a great gothic story with psychological depth and stuff, just like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So you can find like poems like that. I also saw a nice illustrated version of that Robert Frost poem with the horse. My little horse must think it queer. What is that poem called? Stopping on Woods in a Snowy Evening or something like that. But yeah, like I saw that in a shop and thought it was illustrated really well, and like the poem is beautiful, and like sometimes just having a single poem in a book, even if it's a short book, is nice. And an easier way to get into poetry for people who prefer like narrative, like a story and characters and stuff, I think, is to have like a book which is just one poem, even if it's a short poem, right, rather than a collection of poetry. Now on to the intermediate section, which are poems that I think would be like probably a little bit more of a challenge for people who don't normally read poetry to begin with, but you know, for like, if you already like poetry, then maybe just jump in here, right? And I'm putting the Metamorphoses by Ovid first. I kind of debated whether I should put epic poetry onto this list, because epic poetry is like a whole list unto itself, yeah? But, you know, if I was going to recommend just one epic poem to somebody who's just like dipping their toes into narrative poetry, then it would definitely be this one. The good thing about the Metamorphoses is, even though it is a big boy, right? It's a brick. Especially this edition, most modern editions break the poem down into like separate characters. It's already broken into books, book 1, book 2, book 3, right? Ovid kind of separates it that way. But also the modern editions tend to break it into like characters like Arachne, and like, because it goes through all like, well, not all, but like kind of a whole load of Greek myths, right? It's like kind of the compendium of Greek myths. So you can kind of tackle it however you like. You can just, if you want to read about Medusa one day, you can read what he has to say about Medusa. And it's only going to be like, sometimes it'll be a few pages, sometimes it'll be just like a few lines. This edition, this Penguin edition, or at least the translation by David Raeburn, is the one that I recommend. Like the meter makes it feel like quite classical, right? He tries to keep the Greek, the Roman meter in it. But the language and the diction is quite modern, but not too modern. Like there's not like lots of modern slang and stuff, but it's incredibly easy to read, I think. And of course, like if you want to read it properly, like cover to cover, you'll get a lot more out of it, because there's so much like clever structuring, like between the books, like the books of the poem, that like book 1, book 2, book 3, right? Because like, you know, poems at the beginning kind of balance the ones that come at the end. Each book kind of has its own themes and its own developments. Like for example, like book 3, I think, is like has Dionysus as a god that just keeps on coming back, and then like, so it's kind of his book. And then the next one is kind of like Hera, and she's kind of like a counterbalance because she doesn't like him for certain reasons that we find in the plot. And there's just like so much like large scale clever stuff going on in this. But if you also just want to read like the story of Perseus fighting the Medusa, it's also there, right? So you can kind of appreciate it on different levels. My boy Ovid is just like giving you all the choices here. So, you know, he's versatile. Next up is Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov. And I'm kind of grading this list. I've realized like, I think Metamorphoses and Pale Fire could kind of be in the beginnery section as well. You know, like if you're not such a poetry kind of person, but you want to, you know, read a story or something like that, then these could work, because this is kind of a puzzle box of a book. Like it's ostensibly it's a poem with an introduction and notes and footnotes, right? Like when I went into it, I thought that's what it was. So it's kind of fun to go into it not knowing what it is, but like at the same time, I have to explain what it is to justify its position on this list, and to, you know, introduce the book to you like people do in these videos. So yeah, it's actually a novel, but you know, it's pretending to be an introduction and an editor's note, and then a poem, and then a lot of footnotes explaining the poem. So what you have to do is you read it all, and then you kind of get the story out of putting those pieces together. So for example, it's not the poem so much as like how the editor interprets the poem, let's say. That's where the real narrative of the story lies. The poem isn't the whole book. The poem is like kind of the middle section, like in between, sandwiched between the introduction and then the footnotes at the end. And you can kind of read it how you like as well. You could read it like in a normal book. Like some people don't read the footnotes, right? Or they read the footnotes after they've experienced the work kind of as a whole, like fresh, right? Without a little academic in their ear explaining things to them all the time. Most people, I think, like, probably jump to the footnotes as they read. That's probably how I do it most of the time as well. And you can read this that way or the other way. Either way you can read it, but the story isn't in the poem. The poem is like a means to get to the story. The themes are kind of similar to Lolita, I think. Not in terms of like pedophilia or anything, but like with the theme of like domination and control and like taking over someone's life. I can't stress enough that like the pleasure you get from this book isn't from like how affecting the poetry is really. You know, the poetry is not the main thing here. The poetry is subsumed under a greater sort of narrative puzzle that's going on, and that's where the enjoyment in the book lies. Next is Autobiography of Red by Carson. This one even has the subtitle, A Novel in Verse. So like this is like kind of the perfect book for this for this list. Although to be fair, I also feel like this is one of those ones where you kind of forget that you're reading poetry, you know, like the Emperor's Babe. Like it kind of feels almost like you just forget about like the line breaks and stuff like that because it feels so narrative based, I thought. But yeah, like this is the kind of Greek myth retelling based on an ancient poem, but it's also like a modern love story between two teenagers in America, and there's like a lot of philosophical stuff going on here to do with photography and time. There's this recurring image of a volcano, and it's about like kind of coming of age, having the gay awakening. So yeah, in many ways it feels like a modern philosophical coming of age love story that just happens to be a poem as well. What the poetry does though is it kind of makes it very based on like impressions and like it's very fragmented. We get some pretty strange like abstract images that just appear sometimes in a way that would probably feel more out of place in narrative fiction, like I mean in prose, sorry, than in poetry. So I do think like that is maybe what pushes it into the intermediate level rather than like the beginner. Next is Penthesilea by Heinrich von Kleist, translated by Joel Agee. This edition is actually illustrated by Maurice Sendak, which is very exciting because like, you know, where the wild things are and stuff. He's got all sorts of lovely pictures all the way through. But yeah, this is yet another Greek myth retelling. I'm sorry my otaku is showing here, but what can I say? I'm a fan. This is a story of how during the Trojan War, the Amazonian warriors joined the fray. Usually they join on the side of the Trojans to fight off the Greeks. In this version, that seems to be what happens, but then it seems like they're just killing everybody. And there's like this kind of tension between like the two sides of male soldiers in the war who are like trying to fight for what they think is like kind of a reasonable cause, you know, to win back Helen of Troy, blah, blah, blah. And then the women who they don't understand, like, but you're just killing people. Like, this is madness. This is barbarity. So it's got some like humor in it, as well as like interesting gender dynamics and stuff like that. The main driving force in this though is like kind of pure, intense passion, like constantly. So much that it is a bit too much sometimes by the time you get to the end of it. It is exhausting to read this book. There is so much frenzy. I want to see it performed. Honestly, I would love to see, more than any other play, I'd love to see a modern version of Penthesilea performed because it goes absolutely nuts by the end of it. This is all driven by like these two central characters, Queen of the Amazons, Penthesilea, and the strongest soldier on the Greek side, Achilles. And they are both like determined to have sex with each other and kill each other, and like kind of in the same moment, it seems like there is so much like lust in this, like death lust, and like lust. The translator won a prize here for what he did with Kleist poetry, and honestly, like it has got some really beautiful kind of classical style sections and poetry, like, and it gets quite psychological as well, and it's very emotional, and like I think it's absolutely fantastic. It just wore me out by the end of it. I just couldn't sustain that level of intensity all the way through to the end. Like if you try to live your life with everything turned up to 11 all the time, you know, you'll burn out. And I think that's kind of in the play as well. But yeah, it in a way works against it, I think, at the very end, which is a shame because otherwise this would probably be like up there with my all-time favorite things. But as it is, it's still like as long as you know, have a little break, take a glass of water, have a lie down when you need it, then I recommend it. Next up is someone who Kleist hated and had like a whole persecution complex around him. It's the one and only Goethe. I don't know what I've done with my edition of Faust Part 1, but I'll put a little image here for you. This is the age-old classic story of the scholar who just wanted more. He learned as much as he could, but he wanted to go into the occult. He wanted to go past the limits of what man should know. And he summons a demon or Satan, kind of like, I think in Goethe's version it is the devil, isn't it? Mephistopheles, I think is just like a version of the devil rather than a sub-demon or something like that. But anyway, he summons the devil, Mephistopheles, who is a charming gentleman. This translation, I think, is by David Luke. I'll put it down in the description anyways. But it's really brilliant, really easy to read. The rhyme is brilliant. I think, like, I don't know German, but I think it must be kind of similar to English because of how great some of the German to English translations of poetry I've read are. Like the rhymes are just like so good. But yeah, Faust Part 1 is very readable. Like Penthesilea, it's also a play. So you've got clearly like designated characters saying their piece, and like you know it's all like dialogue, right? So that's like also very readable. There's a love story with Faust and Gretchen. The characters are just really fun. Like Mephistopheles is this charming, aristocratic, Wildian sort of witty gentleman devil. Faust is like very angsty and young and earnest. And Gretchen, to be honest, I don't remember her personality that much, except she falls in love and feels bad about it. But this play is so famous that you can enjoy like other works of art like alongside it. For example, the piano piece Gretchen am Spinnrad or Spinnrad, I don't know, is like Gretchen at the spinning wheel. That's by Liszt transcribing Schubert, I think, right? And it's brilliant, it's beautiful, and you can hear her like kind of spinning at the wheel and being sad about Faust through the piano. It's such a gorgeous piece. And that's the great thing about Faust, right? Not only does it give you a great story and, you know, a great poetry, it also gives you a great playlist to be listening to alongside your reading. However, if you want to get the whole story, you need to move into the next part of this list, because I'm kicking off the hard mode section of these recommendations with Faust Part 2 by Goethe. Faust Part 2 is, in my opinion, better than Faust Part 1, but a lot of people just don't read it because it's so wacky. It's like, as Faust explores, you know, the potential of the powers that he's been given by the devil in exchange for his soul. I should have said that at the beginning, but I think everyone knows what a Faustian bargain is, right? But yeah, like he's exploring that potential. So it just, everything has to get a bit crazier, and the writing gets crazier, and he goes to meet Helen of Troy because he wants to see the most beautiful woman in the world, right? And then he kind of goes into the world of Greek myth. And I know some of you are going, okay, I get it. This is why Seb likes Part 2 better, because it's full of Greek mythology. Then I'm not going to deny that entirely, but I will also say that I love, yes, like the kind of craziness of it, like the fact that it just goes everywhere and the poetry is still beautiful and it's still connected to the same themes as the first part, but also developing them in interesting ways. But yeah, in a way, it's almost a little bit like Penthesilea and how off the rails it goes, which is ironic because of how opposed Kleist and Goethe were in so many different ways. I'm going to go back to Ovid now for his poem Tristia. This isn't an epic poem, unlike Metamorphoses. This is lyric poetry. It's what he wrote after he was exiled from Rome to the very furthest edges of the empire. We're kind of going full circle here because I began with the edges of the empire with the, what's it called? The Emperor's Babe, right? But that was London, and this is like in Romania. There's a place called Tomis at the time. But yeah, lots of Celtic tribes, and like for someone who'd enjoyed like the privileges of a happy middle class life in Rome, having, you know, liking to do your gardening and having a library and all this stuff, suddenly to be in a colonial outpost, you know, where you have to worry about invading tribes and stuff like that, and the weather is not very nice, was really tough for Ovid. And he lets us know, boy does he let us know. This poem Tristia is like lament or like sad song, and he is just singing his heart out, telling us how difficult his life is. The reason why this is in the hard section, despite this beautiful translation by Peter Green, is just because I think people are likely to get fed up with Ovid before they make it to the end of the book. And it's I love it. It's like just one of my favorite pieces of literature, because even though it's a technique that he does in lots of his works, that he repeats a kind of a theme, and then he delves into it by like taking different examples, sometimes from mythology, but sometimes just like, sometimes he addresses people he knows back in Rome, right? A lot of them are to his wife, some are to his daughter, and like you just, through the repetition, you get these slight changes, and they just create this deeper and deeper picture of a person. No, it's an autobiography. That's the thing. It's an autobiography in the form of whinging. Definitely, you'll want to be reading like the notes alongside this. Like the notes were so helpful in getting the most out of this poem for me. And also, like, you know, maybe read the Metamorphoses first, or get a sense of who Ovid is and stuff like that before you go into this, is what I'd recommend. It's less necessary, although useful, to have a knowledge of like Greek mythology and stuff like that if you want to read Omeros by Derek Walcott. This is set in the Caribbean. It's kind of like a post-colonial epic poem, which is riffing on stories from the Greek myths like Achilles, and especially to do with the Trojan War. There's characters who have names which reference them and stuff like that. But it's it's more about the soul of this island where Derek Walcott comes from. St. Lucia, I think it's called, and dealing with like the weight of history, you know, with like slavery and with like kind of modern tourists like on the island, what what it has become now as a tourist destination compared to what it was before as a colony, and like before that when the slaves came from Africa and so on. But the main thing to recommend this is less the story and more just the beautiful poetry. Like, he's written it in a sort of I think it's called terza rima, the thing that Dante used to write the Inferno, but it's not exactly that, but it's kind of similar, of like 3 lines, and like it's the rhyme falls on like alternate lines, and then it gradually shifts as you go through. But like, yeah, it's something that you need to kind of read once for meaning, and then again just out loud for the sound. It's just the sounds of these words as he puts them together is like magic. And of all the poems on this list, I would say this one is probably like the most verbally rich. Like, the language on a line by line level is so satisfying and so like kind of almost decadent in this one. Like, maybe I'm just saying like this is poetically the best thing that I'm recommending to you here. Although the next one also kind of, although in a more abstract way, could take that title as well. The Age of Anxiety by W.H. Auden. I'm not gonna lie, this one is too difficult for me. Like, I did not understand a lot of what I read in this poem. It starts off in a bar with 4 people meeting, like just chance strangers, right? 3 men and a woman. And it's in a bar, and I think it's either during or just after World War II, maybe during, I don't remember, but like the war is hanging over everything. And these characters start like talking, and they've got their own kind of poetic viewpoint. It's almost like 4 poems, you know what I mean? Like kind of coming together in a way, because each character has their own individuality, which is a fascinating thing to read. And like it's interesting because you get the characterization, but you also get like almost 4 different types of poems with different approaches to the world. And it's quite abstract. And then it goes kind of crazy. They go into this sort of like thought experiment, but it becomes like a dream world that the 4 of them are like traversing through to explore their ideas and then who they are. Honestly, I got lost. This thing is like Faust 2 on crack. Like, but maybe that's kind of the point. Maybe you're meant to be lost a bit, because I don't think that meaning always comes from understanding, right? When it comes to art, sometimes stuff, you don't get it all, but there's something which hits you that you can't quite describe, and that makes it worthwhile, right? I definitely felt that with this poem. And there were certain lines of poetry which just felt so psychologically true and beautiful, and I wrote them down and stuff like that. But how they fit into the bigger picture of the 4 characters on their sort of metaphysical journey, I couldn't tell you. But if you're like a veteran of long form narrative poems, or if you're a total beginner and you just want to be thrown straight in at the deep end, then obviously by all means go for The Age of Anxiety by W.H. Auden. It is a trip. So that is all for now. As for what I'm looking forward to in this genre, it's obviously Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but also I asked my dad about this when I was making this list, and he recommended this book, The Midnight Court, which is translated by Ciarán Carson. It's an Irish poem from someone called Brian Merriman, who wrote it in like the 1700s, and it's about a guy who gets like abducted by all these female fairies who start like berating him in some sort of nightmare world. And apparently it's quite bawdy, and there's like a lot of sort of sexy satire going on. So I'm really excited to read this too. Let me know if you have any long form narrative poems that you'd like to recommend to me. I am on the lookout for these. I do not know enough of them. I do not have enough in my life. I want more. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please click like, subscribe, all that nonsense. I'm gonna go have a cup of coffee. Bye bye.